Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very special PETA webinar. My name is Cassie Chung. I look after the communications and marketing here at PETA, and I am so delighted to be spending the next 45 minutes or so with all of you. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land from which I'm speaking to you today, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I just want to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Now, this webinar is a really exciting one. We have, in conjunction with the Australian Children's Laureate Foundation, we have come up with a way to connect the current Australian Children's Laureate, Ursula Dubosarsky, with teachers all across Australia. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask Ursula a few questions, learn more about her laureate term, what she thinks about young people's relationship to reading. But this is your webinar. So really, I do want to encourage you to ask some questions. Just pop them in the chat box, and as we go through the webinar, I'll be able to ask those for you on your behalf. So just drop them down in the chat box at any point. You don't have to wait until the end. You can pop them in as we chat, and we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. So do participate. You're very welcome to, and we'd love to know what you're thinking, what your thoughts are, what your questions are. Now, just before I get started, I just want to reiterate really quickly that we are recording this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep people's microphones on mute and cameras off, and we will get started. So Ursula Dubosarsky has been a writer for over 30 years and has written more than 60 books, that's 60 books. That's so many books. Think of 60 books, and they're all from Ursula. Incredible. She has also worked as the editor for the New South Wales School magazine for a time in there. But what is really interesting to me is that I learned when looking at the FAQ on Ursula's website is that she knew she wanted to be a writer when she was 6 years old, when she wanted to write a story or a book about a bus driver. Ursula, welcome. Why did you want to write about a bus driver?
How strange. I'd sort of forgotten that. I don't know where I wrote that down, but it's definitely true. In fact, it's one of those interesting pre-reading and writing memories, because it was before I could read and write. But I had an impulse to write what I was imagining in my head down. I would write it in the dirt with a stick in my own alphabet. And I just remember this sort of intense feeling of satisfaction of there was a difference between just inventing a story in my head and then putting it down, you know, in writing. And it was definitely about a bus driver. So I must have been on a bus with my mother and found it to be a very impressive experience in some way. I'm afraid I don't remember any more about the drama of the story, but I have a very strong memory of the feeling of sort of satisfaction and excitement about expressing myself in writing.
That is incredible that you have such a strong memory of it too, from such a tiny age. It's incredible.
Funny, isn't it? Because people, you know, it's not an infrequent and very intelligent and sensible question is, you know, what made you want to be a writer? And, you know, I think as many writers as there are, there'll be as many answers. But it's my experience, I don't think is that uncommon, that it's just some sort of inner impulse that you're not particularly seeking out. It feels like it's seeking you out. And of course, at that age, it just seems like it's just like, you know, throwing a bucket of water or something. It's just something you do that you want to do, and you do it. So certainly when I was actually, interestingly enough, for someone who became a very fanatical reader as a child, I was reasonably slow learning to read. I didn't learn to read in kindergarten. I learned to read about halfway through year one. And again, there was that second moment, I guess, of realization, because as I said, I was sort of making up alphabets and so on until I actually learnt to write one that other people would understand. And that was a second feeling, almost of a kind of power, I think, that you could communicate with another person. The thoughts in your head didn't have to stay in your head. I wasn't I wouldn't overdo it. I wasn't like, you know, fanatically shy or anything like that, but I wasn't outgoing, I suppose. And perhaps more, I don't know, introverted personalities are particularly attracted to writing, because all human beings want to express themselves and communicate with others. And I suppose writing is a way that you can do it if you're not a confident, I don't know, socially confident in a way.
It's really interesting.
I invented that series. So, but when I think of myself as a child, I guess I'm just letting those, I'm just trying to remember what the feelings were, and those were the sort of feelings I had.
That's really interesting. How has that directed you to the theme of your Children's Laureate term, which is read for your life? Do you see yourself in that? What does read for your life mean for you?
Well, look, it's I suppose it has a certain level of play on words. You know, read for your life, a bit like run for your life. You know, so in a sense, read to save your life is putting it in a very kind of, you know, grand way. But I suppose at some level I do, certainly as a child, I felt reading was as essential as eating or sleeping. Like it just wasn't negotiable in my mind. It was just something I had to do. But the read for your life, the primary meaning in the context of the goals of the Australian Children's Laureate, which is essentially the role is that of a reading ambassador. It's to promote reading in children, to encourage and make children excited about reading. And for me, my kind of project, or as the laureate, because there've been 5 children's laureates, and each children's laureate chooses their own particular project. And mine, as you can sort of tell if you look at the poster, is very much about getting children to join their local library and develop that habit of reading, which will turn into a lifetime habit. So that you don't just learn to read and that's that. You spend your entire life learning to read. I always tell children that every single book I read, I'm learning to become a better reader. You know, it's not something that you master and it's done, because of course the world of words and literature is constantly changing and developing, and you have to keep reading to be able to have as many choices as possible that you can read. Because I suppose what I'm trying to say, that's what I feel very strongly about the library, is all that choice inside the library of types of books that you can read from the past and the present. And the more you read, the more choice you have, because you will be a better reader. I mean, that's what being a better reader is all about. It's so that you can feel adventurous and confident picking up books, that you learning your own taste and the power of your own ability to choose books that you want to read. So I guess I hope that wasn't sort of didn't sound too circular, but the read for your life is definitely about the notion of reading being a constant part of your life, not something that you do sometimes or that you put to one side once you feel that part of your life is over.
How do you think that we can encourage reading to become this lifelong habit, something that doesn't end when the term is over, or when primary school is over, or when school is over for the day and you go home in the evening? What do you think teachers and parents, but teachers maybe particularly, can do to help foster reading to move outside of the classroom and into people's lives?
Well, look, from my point of view, and I will be completely fascinated to hear the points of view of the actual life experience of teachers in the classroom. But I suppose to me as a child and with my own children, that going to the library and becoming a member of the local library, which is not part of school. So I guess the thing about the local library is you go to the local library for pleasure. You know, it's about developing reading for pleasure. Thinking of reading for pleasure is just a really important thing of childhood. And of course, pleasure, which we all seek, will then mean if a child finds pleasure in reading, they will read all the time. And that is the way they'll become a better reader. If coerced reading, as we all know, is not very successful. So the child, in a way, we don't really know what our children want to read, because, you know, every human being in a way has to beat out their own path to find the books they want to read. We can make recommendations and suggestions and lists, but in the end, that person needs the inner motivation that they sort of own their reading, that they've chosen what they want to read. And I suppose what I've, you know, said to people who have said to me, oh, my child won't read, I mean, has no interest in reading or takes no pleasure in reading. I mean, my advice, such as it's worth, is, you know, I would take that child down to the local library and get a library card with their name on it, and then tell them, oh, just go to the shelves and just find one single book that to take home. You don't even have to like it. Just any old book. That's all that's the only request I would make. And they may say, there's not a single book in this entire library I have any interest in reading. And I would just accept that. But then I would go back the next week and say, have a look for a book that you might want to take home. And the next week and the next week. And eventually, obviously, they will find something in the library. The libraries are, you know, as school libraries, local libraries are these, you know, palaces of wonderful selections of books to appeal to all kinds of children. They will find something they want to read and or take home. And they will also, which is very important, they will also find lots of books they don't like, that they don't want to read. And that is part of the entire process of, I suppose, freely finding books you don't like and knowing that you don't like them. And then it's about access and exposure and opportunity reading, I think, and repeated access and exposure and opportunity. And I suppose from the point of view of the parent or teacher, not losing heart, you know, because the world over, people do love to read, you know, given access and opportunity, they do love to read. So it's obviously, you know, when I was a child, I didn't differentiate in my mind between film, television, music and reading. They all fed my imagination and my sort of imaginative games, and I didn't make a difference between them. But of course, television and film were not very accessible. You know, I was only allowed to watch half an hour of television a day, and you went to the movies in the school holidays. And so books were extremely accessible sources of the imagination. Obviously, that's not the world we're now living in. And children's imaginations are richly fed by lots of other things than reading. But you can't get away from the fact that the only thing that will make children better readers is reading. You know, that's what books have over everything else. They make you a better reader. And clearly reading and writing with understanding and clarity and response is, you know, the foundation of education, and also has enormous ramifications for your whole life, educationally, socially, economically. It's just, reading does remain tremendously important for all children, and we don't want to get to a situation where only a small elite of the population are good readers and the rest of us are not. So I totally understand, obviously I'm living in the same world we're all living in, that there are wonderful sources of imaginative story for children that have got nothing to do with books, and they, you know, they are wonderful, but they won't make them a better reader. Only books, only reading will make you a better reader.
Do you remember a moment where you picked up a book, a children's book, when you were a child and felt that it made you a better reader? Can you pinpoint an experience like that?
I suppose I don't know whether children don't think in those terms, do they? I mean, children don't care if they're a good reader, in a sense. Like, when I say don't care, I suppose that it's not how they think of it. So I don't know if I would have thought of it quite in those terms. This is sort of improving my reading. But I guess I was very aware when I was crossing a boundary. It's a very interesting point to raise, actually. I was very aware when I was crossing a boundary into a sort of new landscape of reading that I hadn't come across before. And sometimes that was something that was hard, you know, and you might sort of put it aside because but sometimes it wasn't hard. Sometimes you just sort of dived into it with sort of great excitement. I mean, I suppose probably for me, the most obvious examples are more when I was moving from, you know, when I was about 11 or 12, when I found myself when I would pick up a book that perhaps wasn't for children, you know, and that was a sort of opening of a kind of a completely sort of unknown world. So that sort of, you know, space when you're sort of crossing over. Look, it's true. See, when I was young, quite a long time ago, there was a certain amount of teenage fiction, but it suffered from low status, I think. And there certainly wasn't a particular section in the library for it. And so there was kind of, it was more divided into children's books, and then there were the adult books. So I suppose when I was at that sort of stage, about 10 or 11, you know, the end of primary school, that was the moment I kind of, you know, started to cross over into adult books. So that, and again, that's not, you know, because you'll often read people, you know, hear people say, oh, well, you know, there was none of this young adult stuff when I was young. We just went straight to adult books. Well, that was sort of because there wasn't much opportunity to read young adult books. You know, it's sort of, I suppose my feeling is books are books. And I guess what's the you know, to repeat myself, the brilliant thing about the library is libraries are free. They're everywhere. Even if you live at a distant place, there's mobile library will come to you. You know, they're free and accessible. They're very democratic institutions that sort of belong to all of us and definitely belong to children. And so I guess it seems to me sometimes there's a lot of emphasis on perhaps buying books or, you know, owning books. But certainly I, as a child, didn't own very many books, or at least compared to the number of books I read, the vast majority of books I read came from the library. There just wouldn't have been enough books for me to read in anybody's home. So, yeah. So you know, I can think of particular titles, but I don't know whether, you know, that's really what you're looking for. But certainly, look, at a younger level, I remember on a holiday when I read my very first book that was a novel when I was 8, which didn't have any pictures. And I remember that as that was called The Mystery of the Pantomime Cat by Enid Blyton. And again, it was that sort of sense of leaping forward, that sort of excitement of opening another door. Now I can read those books. Whereas before you know, when you're a child, you don't want books without pictures. Oh, that'll be too hard. So it was that sort of, there were those sort of stepping stones. But look, I certainly, when I was in year 5 and 6, the teacher librarian, she gave us lists of books that she thought, well, that she strongly encouraged us to sort of broaden our reading, I think, rather than stay in the comfort zone when your reading won't, I suppose, get better. You know, you'll stay stuck. There was no, I have to say, there was no coercion about it, because I think probably, you know, she wanted us to keep that sense of pleasure in reading. And we didn't have to report back or anything like that, but there was this list. And I did actually, I took the list to heart, and I did explore books on that list, which I otherwise wouldn't have explored. So I think there's all sorts of ways to encourage children, you know, to confidently broaden their reading, which I think that's the reading for life. It's a territory that you're exploring. You might sit and camp, you know, for a few months or even a few years in one particularly nice spot, but you actually, you have to get up and keep on going.
When you're writing for children, how do you think, where do you think of yourself sort of in that journey of reading and writing and this lifelong story of camping out for a little while? What do you think of when you are writing a book of who might be picking it up and where they might be in their reading journey? Is that something that factors into the creation of the story?
Much more conscious when I'm writing for young children. When I'm writing for young children, I have a definite sense of a group of them sitting in front of me. And I have to, it's not so much I have to entertain them or tell jokes or, blow the trumpet, but I have to engage them. I have to keep their attention. And that's through trying as much as possible to be where their mind is, that their level of sort of interest and their knowledge of the world, perhaps is a better way of putting it, where they are in the lifespan, to what will have meaning for them is perhaps. So I'm very aware of that, and that is certainly also affects not just the subject matter and the way I tell the story, but also the vocab. All those sorts of things come into play. A lot of writing is very, as we know, very intuitive. And probably comes out of a lot of reading, because I think all writers are good readers. Not all good readers are good writers, but you won't find good writers who don't read a lot. And I think all that reading informs you somehow, as well as your observation, even if it's imaginary observation of children, but your sort of knowledge of and thinking about children, thinking about what will have meaning for them. When I start to write for, sort of novels, it shifts a little bit more internally, I think. And then I think you're starting more to write for the child inside you, or the child that you remember. It becomes a little bit less of a collective thing and more of a individual thing. And I think that's reflected in my books. I think my books for young children are very accessible to children of all a huge range of, a big range of children. I can see, I know I can successfully read one of my picture books to any group of children that I come across. With my novels, I think it's starting to become a different, particular type of reader, perhaps. But I'm not choosing that particular type of reader. It's just, that's the story that comes out of you. So, you don't have, I suppose, as a writer, that much control in some funny ways over what you write. I always tell children it's a bit like dreaming, like you are the one having the dream at night. It's coming out of your brain. It's not coming out of anywhere else. But you're always surprised by your dreams. And I find I'm always surprised when I'm writing. I'm never quite sure what's going to happen next, that sort of feeling.
I love that. I love the adventurousness of that. The idea that it could go anywhere.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's right. So I suppose I know with my novels that that the novels are not necessarily for every child, whereas with the younger, and that's as it should be. I mean, in a sense, I suppose I think of writing as something that has your individual thumbprint on it. It's a fingerprint of that one person's mind. And that's what I always say to children when I'm doing writing workshops, that, I want the story could only be written by them. We might all be writing the same story about, a bear and a rabbit and a big red apple, but every person will write it differently. And that's sort of the aim, really.
I can't get past this image of you writing a book for young children and picturing a group of young children in front of you to entertain or to capture their attention or to speak to them. There's something in that about the way that quite often books for young children are such a communal experience, and they're read aloud and shared aloud. Do you keep that in mind as well?
Totally.
Sort of the
I tend to think of them as they're like plays, really. They're performance pieces. And I'm very aware when I'm writing them that they're going to be read as performance pieces by many, many different people. So in that sense, I think, there's a lot of rewriting so that the words are not difficult for the reader to read. You know what I mean? That the reader is able to enjoy reading it as well and won't sort of be puzzled or stumble over the words. So, and that is also, those books for young children are also read as sort of private performances, aren't they, by a parent or one person reading to the child. So, look, I have to say, I've most of what I've written are prose and poetry in some of the picture books, but I've always loved plays. And as a child, I read a lot of plays. In fact, that was one of the things I used to like, going to the library to get these big, the best plays of 1959 or something like that. I've always enjoyed reading plays without them needing to be performed, and acting, because I suppose, acting is a kind, it's a kind of writing without putting the words on the page. You're just sort of pretending. So in a sense, with the novels that I write for younger children, things like The Game of the Goose or Brenda Bella, I also think of them often as performance pieces, because I'm hoping, and I know that often they are read aloud to the class. So, chapter by chapter over a few weeks. And so in that sense, it's important that, so they're both kind of, I guess they're sort of oral as well as written. So the sounds of the language and I suppose, because when you are listening to a story, it dictates a certain kind of, it has to be kind of apprehendable. That doesn't mean it's obvious, or that, it's sort of, you necessarily know what's happening next, or you can guess the ending or something, but it has to be sort of apprehendable by not just the reader, but the children, that it like a play. You can't be sitting and thinking, oh, what's happening? I don't understand, so it has to have a certain kind of, so yes, so that's sort of, in a way, those novels are a different thing altogether. They're still, in a way, perhaps I'm thinking of that group of slightly older children sitting there colouring in or something while I'm reading to them, and certainly also thinking of the teacher or the parent or whoever might be reading it to them, to make it a pleasurable experience for everybody, I guess.
Yeah, that pleasurable experience just comes back to what you were saying before too, that's what we're all seeking when we're out there doing it.
I do think, reading for pleasure, if that's absolutely, if there's a message to be had, it's how important that is, to encourage reading for pleasure, and to encourage children to know that they can get pleasure out of books, because that way they will continue reading.
How do you think that you can demonstrate the message that reading can be pleasurable to young people?
Well, look, I have to say, every school library I've ever gone into, and certainly I guess I'm largely invited to school libraries with very happy, motivated school librarians, but certainly the libraries are, beautiful, joyous spaces that spell happiness. And I think that is really important. I think children are very sensitive to atmosphere. I mean, that's why they like McDonald's, because, all those bright colours say, children, welcome here. So the library has to actually, in its physical space, say to them, you're welcome here. This is where you're going to be happy. This is where you're going to be free and happy. And most school libraries are like that, because obviously teachers understand that very well. And certainly most municipal libraries are like that. There's the physical space of the library indicates this is a place where you're going to have a good time. I guess there's, look, when I think back to my own childhood, because I guess I just came from a family that just read all the time. And so, but, so for me, it was an obvious source of pleasure because every time I looked around, someone was reading. And why would they be reading? Only because they wanted to. Like I was never, we were never told to read. We never had to be, if you know what I mean. We just all wanted to read. However, not everybody obviously comes from families where there's nothing to do but read. They might come from families where there's more entertainment on offer, or families that are not interested in reading. So I know it's often said it's important to model reading, and obviously that is important, but and can be incredibly effective and can only be encouraged, but not everybody will be able to or want to model reading. And so I suppose from the point of view of teachers, I think the teachers, I sort of feel a bit ridiculous offering advice to teachers, because I think, there's nothing like the reality of the coalface in terms of whatever platitudes that I might come up with about encouraging children to reading. But, I guess, obviously being enthusiastic about reading, I suppose what I said, and look, not many teachers or librarians would do this, but I think it's important not to, I did have one librarian who did make me feel a little bit ashamed of reading Enid Blyton, for example. And I remember that as a kind of a shame. And obviously she had the best intentions at heart. She wanted me to broaden my horizons and stop reading Enid Blyton. But I think my mother, for example, never commented on anything I read, would never have made me feel ashamed of anything I read. And I think, so that was good because I had that as a sort of an alternative. But I think it's a pity for children to feel any sense of sort of shame or blame about what they're reading, because that's just an unfortunate kind of feeling to associate with what you're reading. And I think, after a certain number of years, I think it would have been around year 6, actually, as you sadly put the teddy bear away, I completely lost interest by myself in Enid Blyton. It no longer interested me. I sort of didn't, it wasn't like I was 16 years old doing the HSC reading Enid Blyton. I put it aside myself when it no longer interested me. But it gave me enormous pleasure at the time, and also enormous imaginative recreation of all those situations in all those many Enid Blyton books I read. So so I suppose that's the thing I would say, was to accept children's choices, I guess, but at the same time keep the doors open to that librarian who would hand out the list, and I can remember a book on the list that I was completely mystified by. It was by Paul Zindel. It would have been a contemporary book at the time, and it was called, it was a great title. It was called My Darling, My Hamburger. And I have absolutely the book meant literally nothing to me, but I read it. Later in life, apparently it's about a teenage pregnancy and drugs. I don't know what it was.
It is.
But it meant nothing to me because it was completely, I just meant nothing to me, but I read it, I read it. And I've remembered it, My Darling, My Hamburger. I often say it to the kids, My Darling, My Hamburger. But I guess I was never sort of asked to comment on it or report back or write something down about it. Or somebody was asking me, did my family, when at home, did we talk about books? Well, we didn't much. We just read them. There wasn't a lot of discussion. We didn't sit around talking about books or what are you reading or anything like that. We when we finished one book, we picked up the next one. And I certainly went to the library every week as a child. We had the school library. You're only allowed to borrow 2 books. That wouldn't have been enough. I went to the local public library on the bus every Saturday morning to get the 6 books. And I was pretty spontaneous in my choices. I read very widely. I mean, I preferred Enid Blyton, but there was only so many Enid Blyton books in the library. So I had to borrow other books because I would have nothing to read. And the thought of having nothing to read was very, very stressful. And so I would just pretty spontaneously pick the books from the shelf fairly promiscuously, in a sense, because it seemed to me, I didn't really worry about it. Oh, will I like it? Won't I like it? I don't like books like that. I just thought, it's a book. It's there to be read. I'll read it. And I would read it. And obviously I had preferences. I like certain books more than others. But I just read anything that was there to be read. And so in a sense, as a child, I had a much broader genre readings than I do as an adult. You know, I mainly read realistic fiction as an adult, but as a child, I read everything. You know, historical fiction, fantasy, everything, you know, which I wouldn't read now. So
Yeah.
I suppose I also think there shouldn't be too much pondering about what book to take home or what to read. Just sort of, it's all an adventure, you know, and if you don't like it, then you've learned something. You know, that's a plus. It's a step forward.
Absolutely. I just want to go back quickly to what you were saying about the sense of being in the library and the stimulation that comes from there. We have a comment from Marie, who said that multi-sensory experiences are so important to stimulate imaginations and curiosities. And then just brags a little bit that they're very fortunate in Western Australia that students are able to resume excursions and learning outside the classroom, which obviously some of us cannot do, but I'm very happy for Marie. But that's just really interesting that what you felt instinctively about what engages imaginations is bearing up in our comments as well.
Well, look, and also it's a really good point that because we haven't really talked about this, but of course, what children like to read is when they read, let me grab one, is a book. You know, that's what they like to read. They're on their devices nonstop, but they don't read books on their devices. A few will, but very few. They like to, you know, they want the thing that you open and close, that you hold, that you throw, that object of a book. And that's what's so incredibly important about libraries for children. In the lockdown, you know, adults, I think, have been reading a lot more electronic books, but I'm extremely skeptical if anyone suggests children are reading a lot of electronic books in the lockdown. I think that's remotely unlikely. And I think that's incredibly sad. That's why I think, you know, the access to actual books, and as was it Marie points out, the library as a sort of place for imaginative play, you know, so that's right, with sort of corners and layers and things to lie on and sit on, and that all those sorts of, you know, all the games as children that you can make out of a simple little hill, you know, so that kind of variety of space. And of course, every book we read as children, and indeed as adults, but more obviously as children, you take into the playground in your head, into the backyard, down the street, on the bus. They're there. You know, children with a story they love, the characters they love, they're endlessly recreating those stories wherever they go. So it's a whole world, you know, the book slips inside the mind, and then it you know, takes 1,000 different forms.
I love that. The book slips inside the mind. I think that is such a beautiful description of what happens when a book really gets to you. What else do we have here? We've got a comment from Megan, which says that she loves your point about not shaming kids about what they're reading and just focusing on them reading, on the fact that they are reading, which she says, and I agree, and I think we would all probably agree, is just so important.
It's not that, you know, one is sort of lowering the standards. Oh, at least they're reading. It doesn't matter what they're reading or whatever. I think it's you know, I'm not sort of saying we should never, you know, extend our children or open them up to new opportunities, but I do think that it's such, you know, emotion is so important. And as you're both saying, that sense of shame is definitely shame or fear of sort of being examined somehow, you know, like, did you read that book? Tell me what happened, you know, that any sort of tension, I think, from adults around reading, hopefully can be avoided. Because often it's with very good intentions, you know. But I think it's funny, isn't it? Because I think reading is it can be a communal experience. It can be a very, very private experience. And, you know, even if you've all listened to the story together, it's not, speaking personally, I've never been very articulate about what I like about a book. Never. So it was sad. I'd never been very good at analysing books or explaining them, which is, I did 4 years of English at university. So, that was a struggle. But what was wonderful was I got to read so many books. But I personally have never been very good at that. So I don't know if it's even necessarily a good way of checking whether someone is, a happy or a good reader. Some children are wonderful at it and love to talk about what they're reading and are remarkably articulate and insightful about what they read. But some of us are not.
We're just having a really lovely moment over here in the chat box where everyone is just really loving on books, which I think is just such a nice vibe for our afternoon. So we have Marie talking about how a visit to the local library shouldn't just be organised for Book Week. Every week is Book Week, yeah. Which I think is the nicest idea in the whole world. And we have someone whose username is mtohulk, which I imagine I'm saying completely incorrectly, but they agree with Megan in that you can never have too many books and can be shifting between reading a number of books at one time. That you don't just have to sit down and finish one and then start the other, which is always what they say when they're asked what they're reading for pleasure. So they're always reading all the things, which is such a nice thing to think about as well. We've got Tina saying that she agrees about kids still preferring to read printed books. I love it. We're just all on the same page and we're all just really passionate about books in this webinar.
I guess, that was interesting what the first comment about not just going to the library for Book Week, although it is only to be commended if you take the children to the library for Book Week. But, it's certainly true that not all children and not all families would even know they're allowed to join the library, or that it's free, or that they're not going to sort of be horribly punished if their book is late or something like that. Do you know what I mean? So I think I mean, a lot of libraries will come in and talk to, do sort of, what do you call it? Whatever that word is, when you come in and visit a school to talk about what they do. And that's certainly, if there's ever an opportunity to talk to children about joining their local library, they do have to join, obviously, with the signature of their parent. So the parent clearly does have to be involved. And I think it is true that not everybody looks through the door of the local library and thinks, I can go in there. That's just, I happen to think that because I was brought up like that. When I feel like I own all the libraries, I have a great sense of entitlement. But not everybody thinks that. I remember a friend of mine who grew up in quite a affluent part of Sydney on the North Shore. She told me she'd never been to a library as a child, and when she walked past them, she thought they were sort of like the TAB or something, like some sort of weird zone for strange people. So where she wasn't allowed to go. So I think you can never assume that people really know what a wonderful free resource the library is. Yes, so I think any opportunity you have to encourage children, obviously, to enjoy their school library if they've got one. But even if they do have a wonderful school library, as I did as a child, I, was also a fanatical card-carrying member of any local library I could get through the doors of.
I think that's a really important idea to take these memories or even just the information that these places are available and sharing that with the young people in our lives. I mean, I'm looking here, there's a comment from Kim who says that their father was a reader and always had a book in hand. And their fondest memories are their weekly trips to the library when they were young, and now they're a teacher librarian. And then Kim says, joy, joy, joy. And I just think, which I love, but the idea of being able to share that experience and being able to say that these are the memories that I've kept with me, and this is the experience that I had, and it's one you can have, is really powerful.
And I suppose, look, you know, because as we know, not all parents, as everybody in this chat room knows, not all parents are interested in reading or are readers or are good readers or anything like that. But they can still take the children to the library, you know. So it's not, and the library is also there for them, you know, obviously it's not just for the children. But I think for children that don't come from reading families, it's still massively to be encouraged that they somehow get to join the local library and start to feel at home there as a place they can go, a public place they can go for free and get books.
Absolutely. I certainly know my family, we're not book people, but they dropped me off at the library every Sunday afternoon for the whole 4 hours it was open, and they came up when it closed to pick me up with all my books.
Exactly. Yeah.
Providing access, that, you know, it makes such a difference.
It's all about access and opportunity, isn't it? So that's, you sometimes hear, or I have read, about a school that they've decided not to have a library anymore because, you've got the books on the shelf and the kids never read them. Well, 100% they will never read them if they're not on the shelf. That is so true. The very least we can do is provide the opportunity.
You are so right about that, I think. And we actually have this incredible comment from everyone is just giving the best comments today. Of course they are, they're great people. Joanne says that she reads to her stage 3 students with lots of drama, and without fail, before she's finished, someone wants to borrow the book. Making characters come to life, picking any book from the shelf, and just reading in a way that engages their imaginations has always been one of their favorite ways to bring books to kids, especially those who are not readers. It's those kids who suddenly want to borrow, which is fantastic.
That's such a beautiful thing. That's wonderful. That's such a gift to those children. And that, I suppose, is in answer to your question that you were asking before, is how to open those doors for children. And that's such a brilliant and beautiful and simple. The thing about reading and books is it's a sort of comparatively simple technology, isn't it? And it's almost in its simplicity. Well, now I'll read you a book that it almost seems too simple, that somehow they won't be that interested in the book. But surprisingly, the books do reach children. They continue to reach readers. So I think we shouldn't worry so much that, they don't make any noise or they're not on a screen or whatever they are. I think the very simple, I certainly have never, and I pretty much you would all agree with me, but there's no, even if children who are born with the telephone in their hand still do love books. They grab them, they want them, they're curious about them. So.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I have to share this one from Claire. You guys are amazing. I love everyone who's in this webinar right now. Claire says that her grandson Blake and Claire, they have an adventure every time they go to the library. So they catch the bus outside Pop's house in the countryside, where Blake is able to sit down the back of the bus all by himself and comment on all the cows and other animals as they travel to the next town. He goes to the desk in the library and gives his wish list. So like, I'd like some books on snakes or dinosaurs or Christmas and ghosts. And they would go to find them, followed by a picnic in the park and back on the bus again. Only one bus every 2 hours. And that's Claire's favorite memory, and cannot wait for lockdown to finish so they can do it again. This idea of making it an adventure is just incredible.
It is. And also a good point there is it's about prioritizing it, making, as I was saying before, there's not a single person in the whole of Australia who doesn't want their children to be a good reader. But in the kind of world we live in, you have to make it a priority, and that's such a beautiful thing that time is set aside for that, because you probably hear parents, and I certainly know people say, there's no time to go to the library on the weekend, we're doing X, Y, Z and Y, and that's terrific. But if you actually want your child to be a good reader, they have to read a lot. That's There's no other way. They won't become a good reader by, you know, through an app or doing a course or by being given one book. You know, that's not going to turn them into a reader. That is such a beautiful story about the, you know, and that obviously was not a very accessible library. You know, they had to make an effort to get there.
Yeah.
And that's really beautiful.
We it's just so lovely. We're about to run out of time, you guys, but these stories are just the best. We have Tina saying that she grew up reading Enid Blyton books too, and her mum gave her first Enid Blyton book, and her adventure with books took off from there, which I think a lot of people can certainly relate to. And then we have a comment from Bernie, who says that parents certainly have a role to play here in supporting children from a very early age. Reading to children is paramount, even long before school age, and then says, take it further and dress up as a character or dramatize the story. And at school level, reading Super Fudge, Staying Alive in Year 5, and Hating Alice and Ashley while eating their lunch each day, then wanting another chapter before going outside to play. It's wonderful.
Well, that's right. And that recalls to me that, you know, when I was at charter school, we used to get into trouble for reading under the desk. You know, it was almost a subversive pleasure. It was like, you know, eating a bag of meringues under the desk. So it had this, you know, it just drawn to this, you know, pleasure of the book. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's it's exactly like that. What else do we have? We have Jaden saying that Jaden says, my wife and I have created a reading corner for our 13-month son, starting him young. Because we've been reading to him from a couple of weeks old, he now pulls books down from his bookcase and flips through them by himself or with us.
And he's learning so much in that simple act. It's so interesting, isn't it? In that simple act, you know, because while it is a simple technology, it's full of rules. You know, you open the book, it goes this direction, you know, the character is the same on every page, you know, it's the same person that's having the story. There are words, there are pictures, like there's 100 things to learn. And I think I've certainly observed babies are fascinated by books, you know, it's and it's not sort of, sometimes people will say, oh, you know, they're too young, they can't get anything out of it, but wow, they soak it all up and they learn. It's a cumulative knowledge, reading for life right from the beginning. That's beautiful.
It's so beautiful. All of this is so beautiful. We have Joanne, who says that in their school library, they made the decision that all library lessons would begin with silent reading, but that doesn't really happen anymore because the kids now, without any help, have turned it into talk about books. They read a bit and suddenly they're all talking to each other about what they're reading. That's
really beautiful. So just sort of spontaneously having a book club. I mean, it's interesting too about the silent reading, because it is also a fact, as we all know, the phone, the disruption of life. There is a kind of, reading does require a certain level of zone concentration. There's no two ways about it. And that again is something that you're sort of in this very exciting world that we live in. You have to make a decision to do that. When I was a child, there's not much going on. Lie there and read a book, but they don't live in that world. So I think that's right. We have to really think hard about how we can make that space, because we want them to be good readers.
I think that's exactly right. And we have a comment from Robin that says that these stories of special events and memories of stories and books are so important and needed now more than ever, which I think I really do agree with, because it's been a tough year. And I feel like this has been such a lovely pick-me-up and a reminder of why we're all working very hard to make reading more accessible and more available to people, because it brings us all so much joy that you could just reach out and touch. And I am so glad that we've had this afternoon together. I feel just really rejuvenated. And I don't think I'm the only one.
Fantastic. Yeah. You know, very grateful and glad to have been invited. So it's inspiring.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all of us for joining us. We have just run over just a little bit. If anyone does have a final question, now is the time to get it in. But if not, maybe we just walk away with a lot of joy, and we will share the video with all the people that we think needs a little bit more joy in their lives, and pick up an old book and give it a read tonight, perhaps. This has been such a lovely time. Oh gosh, we have Jodie saying that she started reading to each of her babies while still in the hospital. And it was how she taught them the difference between day and night. It would read to them at each feed during the day, but no reading or talking at night.
Fantastic. That's a committed mother.
Isn't that amazing?
Inspirational indeed.
I love this. I think everyone who is so committed to sharing reading with other people are just so inspiring. So thank you, all of you, for sharing all of these stories and for being here with all of us. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ursula, for giving us your time. This has been absolutely fantastic. We will all have a lovely evening, I hope. I'll just let our PETA members know really quickly that we have some really exciting webinars coming up that we're just putting on our website now. We've got one that explores the role of music in helping students to read and write. And we have one with Peter O'Brien, who worked in a remote school that was 2 buses and a tram car away from Armidale in the 1960s. And he had to teach students from ages 5 to 15, and he had no resources, and he was a brand new teacher, and how he found a love of teaching and learning in that experience. So that's coming up really soon. But we will see you then. We'll share this recording with you as soon as it's up. And thank you again, Ursula, for giving us all of this moment to just come together. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody. It's been really special.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.
Happy reading.